very potent stimulus. Again, 250% rise in baseline, 2.5 times rise in baseline, rivals that of cocaine, which is really remarkable. This is a result that was published in the European Journal of Physiology. I'll go into it in more detail later, but essentially what it involved is having human subjects get into water of different temperatures. So it was warm water, moderately cool water, and cold water. Had them stay in that water for up to an hour, and they measured, by way of blood draw, things like cortisol, norepinephrine, and dopamine. What was fascinating is that cold water exposure led to very rapid increases in norepinephrine and epinephrine, which is also just called adrenaline. It also led to increases in dopamine, and these increases in dopamine were very significant. They kicked in around 10 or 15 minutes after submersion into the cold water, and I should mention the head wasn't below water, it was just up to the neck. And the dopamine release continued to rise and eventually reached 250% above baseline. Now, what was interesting is after subjects got out of this cold water, that dopamine increase was sustained. And I know nowadays many people are interested in using cold water therapy as a way to increase metabolism and fat loss, but also to improve sense of well-being, improve cognition, improve clarity of mind. There's something really special about this very alert but calm state of mind. That seems to be the one that's optimal for pretty much everything except sleep. But for all aspects of work and for social engagement and for sport, that highly alert but calm state of mind really is the sweet spot that I believe most of us would like to achieve. And this cold water exposure, done correctly, really can help people achieve that state of mind through these increases in dopamine that last a very long time. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30 degree Fahrenheit or even low 40 degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60 degree water or 50 degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40 degree water or 45 degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, the study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. What they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reach levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. It was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. One question that many of you are probably asking is, just how cold should the water be? Well, you could mimic what was done in this study and do 14 degrees Celsius, but for some people that won't be cold enough. For some people that will be too cold. They did look at the release of stress hormones like cortisol, in addition to the release of things like epinephrine and adrenaline. And it's interesting that they noted that in all cases, but especially at that coldest temperature, there was an increase in cortisol, but that it was transient, that eventually people's cortisol, the stress hormone, subsided a bit. There are basically two different approaches to remaining in the cold when it's uncomfortable. One is to try and relax yourself, to try and practice slow breathing, to try and dilate your gaze. I've talked about this before in previous podcasts, to go into panoramic vision, to essentially try and calm yourself so that it's not as stressful in the cold. Other people, however, take the approach of trying to ramp up their level of internal autonomic arousal, meaning to get really energized and kind of lean into the friction of the cold, and they find that easier. Other people distract themselves. They recite the alphabet, or they do anything to try and distract themselves from the discomfort. To be totally honest, it does not matter for sake of dopamine release, because the dopamine release is triggered and then continues even after you get out of the cold water. It's well established now that getting into cold water, whether or not it's a shower, an ice bath, circulating cold water, a stream, etc., that can evoke the norepinephrine release immediately and the long arc of that dopamine release. Why would that be good? Up until now, I've basically said getting increases in dopamine are detrimental to your baseline. Well, this does appear to raise the baseline of dopamine for substantial periods of time, and most people report feeling a heightened level of calm and focus after getting out of cold water. So cold water exposure turns out to be a very potent stimulus for shifting the entire milieu, the entire environment of our brain and body, and allowing many people to feel much, much better for a substantial period of time after getting out of the ice bath or cold water of any kind than they did before. Now, you might ask how often to do this. Some people do this every day. It can be very stimulating, so typically doing it early in the day is going to be better. I don't necessarily recommend doing it right before sleep, but some people do it in the afternoon, and some people will indeed do that 7 days a week.